This is what I have to look at every day, my charging station, and it's doing my head in. My OCD got the better of me and I ended up with this instead. Shop furniture is really cool. You get to practice before you move on to the real builds, so tag along if you wish and let's get this done. Using standard pine boards that you can get at your local hardware, the width was established at the table saw and the cross cut done to length on the table sled. The carcass was laid out and each corner numbered and face edges marked so I don't get lost during the build, which is super easy for me to do. All edges were planed up and checked for square. Hand planing is something that I really enjoy. I like using my number 7 plane for the extra weight and a long shooting board on wide boards. After putting a chamfer on the back edge to prevent tear out, the board is squared and cleaned up. Using the sole of the plane as a reference, you can compare with your fingers that the boards are of equal length, and then dial in with a few passes until all is good. Planing mainly the inside faces takes place, as I can't get to them after assembly, with full length strokes moving across the board. I decided to use dovetails as I take any opportunity to practice, so the marking gauge was set to the thickness of the boards. For the tailboard, a light pass was used on the face side as this would be seen, and a heavier baseline created on the inside using multiple passes, with the ends marked for the half pins. The pin board is only marked on the front and back faces, not the edges. I like to highlight the baseline in a red pen so that my shoddy eyes can see better. I like to mark out a light line down the centre of the board, then come in and mark out what looks good for the 2 half pins. Normally we like to walk our dividers across the board to mark out equally spaced dovetails. I prefer to use this drafting compass as it has a very fine pen and pencil so that I can lay out the dovetail spacing without leaving a dimple mark. Where the 2 lines intersect is where I place my pen and use my dovetail marker to do the layout. Marking from the baseline up ensures I don't have a line longer than needed, which I just might accidentally follow when sawing. With my limited grey matter, I have gotten into the habit of marking out the waste so as to remove the waste and not the needed portion, as I've done this a few times, which kinda sucks. The boards are ganged together, flipped around until all the dovetails are transferred to all the ends. To prevent blowout, a small chamfer is created before I come in with a skew block plane with a fence and take equal number of light passes on each board, creating a rebate. Trying to get my dovetails to fit directly from the saw, I nibble away until I establish the square cross cut, then follow the rake angle. I have recently been using magnifying headgear and it has made a huge improvement. Being able to see is kinda handy. Then I slow down and cut as close as I dare to the baseline. Sliding my marking knife over till it clicks into the very light marking gauge line, a deeper knife wall is created between each tail. Coming in with the chisel, a relief is made which I think has improved my dovetailing and prevents the chisel pushing back past the baseline when chopping. A fret saw is used to remove the waste, cutting close to the baseline. For the half pins, a deeper knife wall is established to locate the saw. Here I slightly cut away from the gauge line and will pare back to it later. Starting on the inside face first, the chisel is placed against the rebate created by the skew block plane and I chop until about halfway. I try to keep the chisel vertical as I move along the board. The board is flipped over and work is started from the face side. If the waist is too big, I take small chops and work my way back until my chisel sits in the knife wall. Some like to choke up on the chisel at this point. However, I am sitting down with my elbow on the bench, which gives me control and resistance to stop me from blowing through. Plus it gets these expired old eyes closer to the workpiece. Then it's time for a clean-up. Paring in from the inside, about halfway, then flipping the board and paring in from the face side to prevent any blowout, and then cleaning up the half-pin recess. After putting in some practice and becoming half decent at dovetailing, if you are like me, you can find it quite addictive and you can't wait to find that new project so that you can do it all again. Using the plane as a support and the pin board secured in the vise, the tailboard is placed on top, taking advantage of that rebate to help align it. Once all aligned, and using a sharp pencil, the tailboard becomes the template for the layout. After all the layout is complete, it's time to cut as close to the pencil line as possible without removing any pencil line, attempting to get that off the saw fit. The pin board is created in a similar fashion to the tailboard. Firstly, I establish a deeper knife wall, remove the waste with a fret or a coping saw, chop out the waste, keeping the chisel vertical and as square as possible, and then pare out all the junk, especially in the corners. Without touching the outer corner, as this will show as a gap, a small chamfer is placed on the inside of the tails to ease in fitment. With light taps of a rubber mallet, the joints and carcass is assembled. Taking the nubs down with a chisel plane at this point helps with planing later. Leveling the back face before I go in with the fillister plane and create a rebate for the back panel. After the two shelves are cleaned up, the two side panels are ganged together to mark out the position for the dado housings, and the depth is marked. A knife wall is established to one side of the dado housing first, a marking knife used, and with a chisel on a shallow angle, light chops are taken, creating a relief. The chisel is then placed into the knife wall, and vertical chops are made, working your way along the dado, then back in on a shallow angle, and repeating the process until you get just above the depth required. To get a tight dado, the shelf board can be placed in hard up against the dado wall, and with a marking knife, as if you are trying to reach underneath, spot a mark. Picking up on that mark, you can square a line across, then repeat the process of relief cuts, then vertical chops. This process leaves an apex of waste, and the bulk can be removed with a chisel, before my favourite tool of all, the router plane, comes in to take multiple shallow cuts to the required depth. Squaring up that stopped dado, and a sigh of relief after a test fit, with the joint being self-supporting. With the carcass reassembled, some offcuts and a spring clamp can be used as measuring sticks to measure the shelf length. Transferred to the workpiece, with a knife wall created around all four sides to prevent blowout when sawing. A trough is created to locate the saw and the piece cut, and then squared up to length at the shooting board. With the carcass assembled, the shelf is marked and a notch cut out, which is a standard practice to cover any gaps. I like to use this small palette knife and glue up both the pin and tail board, paying close attention to the side walls. Woodworking has many gods, and now we pray to the dovetail god that all goes well. Now there is an assembly god to pray to. We hope we have practiced a dry run at assembly, marked and numbered our pieces. Sometimes the fibres can swell with the glue, and a block of timber and a heavier hammer usually do the trick. After getting the glue into all of the joints, it's time to keep checking all the numbering and orientation of parts, and to check all components are seated and line up. It's usually at this point that myself and others hold our breath and hope and pray. If you have done your best to work square and as accurate as possible, normally all is good. Using double-sided tape, I have a material known as grubber stuck on the jaws of the clamps. It stops marring the wood. Also, it conforms to the shape of the pin or tails, so I can walk the clamp along each tail, seating them correctly. Now I go clamp crazy, checking that there is no gaps and all is square. The front and back faces get levelled up with a plane, and some cleats are fashioned up which simply get glued and clamped into place, level with the side rebate to accept the backboard. These two cleats will also be used to mount the cabinet to the wall. The plywood backing is plonked in and screwed in place, as this needs to be removed later to mount the chargers. After arguing with myself, deciding whether to build the door or the drawer first, the door won. The door stiles and rails were cut, and faces cleaned up and squared, orientation marked, and using a wheel type gauge to prevent any tear out, a rebate was formed using a fillister plane, starting at the nose, moving back with each stroke until the depth stop. After setting up my mortise jig, I could start chopping the mortise. If I had the grey matter to do a link in the corner thingy, I would, or you could just go to my channel and check it out. It helps keep my chisel perpendicular to the workpiece and aids in cleaning up the side walls. Here I am going for a staggered tenon, which requires a bit of layout, which I'm still getting my head around how to do. Establishing a deeper knife wall to locate the saw, cutting at the bench hook, and then removing the cheek. Cutting the tenon fat like my stomach allows me to come in with a router plane and sneak up on a good fit. It's time to cut out the haunch and clean up the shoulders. I am relatively new to hand tools and I am loving it and addicted to buying them. I should call for a meeting. It's super pleasing when a joint comes together, and all the failed joints, we simply don't film. Gluing and clamping the door frame and certainly checking for square. The extra haunch on the ends are a great way of protecting the corners of the door while you work on it, as they get removed later. While the frame is drying, I start on the beading by planing a 45-degree bevel on one edge, ripping it at the bandsaw, then cleaning up at the shooting board. I am using polycarb for the panel, which is super easy to cut at the table saw. Now it's time to sit the beading in, mark to length, establish a knife wall, cut the miter in a simple fashioned up miter box, and sneak up to fit at the 45-degree shooting board. With the head cut off a brad nail and chucked up, the beading is drilled. Most of the work is now done on the door, so a deep knife wall is made and the haunches removed. With the door frame all secured, I can come in from each end to prevent blowout and clean up. I worked on the door equally from all edges until I achieved a neat fit. To fit the hinges, a wheel type gauge was set to the thickness of the hinge leaf, and the depth was marked. With the bevel down, the chisel was walked across, taking small chops, making sure not to pass the gauge line. With most of the junk removed, it was time to square up the ends with a light vertical chop. The chisel was placed in the gauge line to pair across until we have a nice supporting fit for the hinge. With the door sitting in place, the position of the hinges can be marked and the recess created. The wheel type gauge can be used to define the back wall really nicely. A few screws later and you have a swinging door. For the drawer, I like to get all the sizes from the opening itself, and for now have planed up to a neat fit. I am going for a half-blind dovetails, for which I have only done a few, so I like to use the masking tape method. After carefully tracing around the tails with a sharp knife, you are left with an exact profile of the waist area to be removed. Once the vertical cut lines are marked, and again I go for off the saw fit, I cut right up to the edge of the tape and pay special attention to the top and bottom baselines, making sure not to go past them. It's been a long video, so if you need to pause and get refreshment, go for it, you deserve it. Here I am creating a deeper knife wall, followed by some light vertical chops, then coming in from the front and removing the waist. The procedure is repeated, taking heavier chops each time until you get as close as you dare to the tape lines. I try to let the video do most of the talking, as fumbling through the words in my head can hurt at times. Placing a sharp chisel up against the tape puts me in the exact location to start pairing out the recess, which needs to have all faces square, flat, and free of all debris so the joint comes together nicely. Another quick prayer to the dovetail gods before a test fit, and a sigh of relief. My camera is amazing and only picks up the nice dovetail joints. A groove is ploughed to accept the draw's bum, and for the back of the draw, through dovetails are used. I keep the draw's back shorter, top and bottom, so it doesn't rub inside the carcass. The draw gets levelled and the sides planed to remove all pencil lines and create a neat fit. You can come in from both sides to prevent blowout, or as I like to do, is chamfer the edge and then plane across. Just keep an eye on the chamfer. Now the carcass can be cleaned up, and this is one of my favourite parts, as it gets to feed into my planing addiction. Just remember, if you plane all the way across, to put that small chamfer on the ends. Shellac is super forgiving, and after applying 3 coats and borrowing the mother-in-law's bed sheets, I come in with superfine steel wool and furniture paste, get a smooth finish and buff off with a rag. After working out the configuration of the charges and using the wall mounting feature on the back, a hole was drilled to allow the plug top to pass through and all placed back into the cabinet. With the polycarb plonked in the door frame, cardboard used to protect it from hammer blows, and using the pre-drilled holes, the beading is nailed in place. I better get those bed sheets back on the mother-in-law's bed before she gets home. It's nice to have a place for all my batteries and charging needs. If there is a video you would like me to make, or a build that you wish me to be the test dummy, then chuck it in the comments. As always, get out there and make and create. That reflection comes in handy to get ready for date night. Thanks for watching.